it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making two cards using Sweet November stamps, Farewee Happy Birthday and Horizon Lines Wildflower Meadow. So I've stamped those images out on two separate panels of Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink. And I also did create a very simple mask using a post-it note for one of these scenes. I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers to match some pattern paper from the Cartabella That's My Girl 6x6 pad. So I'm going to flip through and choose one of these prints to use as my color inspiration. And I was going back and forth between this one with the bows and another one with a small floral. And ultimately, I did decide to go with the bows just because the color palette was a little bit more simple, and I thought that that would serve these scenes since there's only two images in each one. So I am going to jump right in with their skin tone. I'm going to start with the lighter of the two, and I'm using E000, E00, and E11. Laying in my shadows with that E11 up under the hairline, down the side of the face, on the underside of the arm and the side of the neck, and also the insides of the legs and up under the skirt where that would be casting a shadow. Then I blended out with the E00, and I'm also going to add in a little bit of E000 for a nice highlight. And then I'll bring in my second panel, and I'm going to do one of these little fairy girls with this skin tone as well. I'm going to reverse it and do the one on the left this time. And I'm going to color her in pretty much the same way, except for that she's facing completely forward. So the shadows on her face are going to be equal on both the left and the right, and the highlight will be in the center around her mouth. For her arms and legs, I'm going to keep the shadows exactly the same. Then I'm going to switch to a slightly darker skin tone by taking away the E000 and adding in the E13. And I will do my other little fairy on my first panel. I'm going to start with that E13 and lay in my shadows with that. And then I'll start to blend out with the E11. For this little fairy, since she's also facing forward, I'm going to do my shading like I did with the fairy on the left on the other panel. And then I'll use that E00 for the highlight. And then I'm going to switch back to the other panel and do the girl on the right hand side with this skin tone. And by the way, let me know if you would be interested in a video on skin tones, including some darker skin tones. That's something that I've been wanting to do for years, and I just have never gotten around to. So let me know if that sounds like something that you guys would be interested in, and maybe I can start to work on that finally. So I am just going to add in this last little fairy girl's shading. She is facing toward the left, so her shadows are going to fall on the right. That way their features stay nice and bright. And I'm going to jump right in with the first little fairy's hair, and I'll be using E51, E53, E55, and E57. This is a combo that is one of my favorite go-tos. I've also recommended it in my Copic favorites video, where I tell you which colors I would recommend you to buy first, because this combo works so great from anything to a really pale blonde to a medium to dark brunette, just depending on how much of each of those shades you put in. So I'm starting with that E51 and mapping out where my darkest colors are going to eventually go. And then I'm building up that color, adding in the E53 and then the E55. And then finally the E57 is going to be my darkest. I'm going to add a few strokes of that as well so that we have some nice low lights mixed in with the highlights. It's going to really help those highlights pop. Once I've gotten to my darkest shade, I'm going to work my way back down in the reverse, and I use very small strokes, holding my marker almost straight up and down, You'll see that my grip is very close to that nib so that I have a lot of control and I'm able to get those super tiny strokes. So it's very different from like when I'm coloring backgrounds and I'm holding that marker much higher up on that barrel to get those nice wide strokes. This is the opposite of that. So once I worked my way back down in the reverse, I left it there as kind of like a dark blonde. And then for my second little fairy girl, I'm going to make her a dark brunette. And I'm going to use E33, E35, E37, and E49. Again, I'm starting with my lightest shade, the E33, and mapping out where the darks are going to go. But starting with my lightest shade just gives me more ability to kind of be flexible and change directions if I decide that I don't like where it's going, if I want her hair to stay on the lighter side, or, you know, if I don't like where I've placed the lines, I can kind of cover over that with the darker colors as I build up. So I'm going to work my way all the way up to my darkest shade once again with that E49, just following the direction that the hair is drawn and adding in those very thin little strokes. And then I'll work my way back down in the reverse once again, and I'm going to eat into that white space that is left a little bit more each time. I still want to leave a little bit of white space, which is going to be covered by my final shade, which is the E33, the one that I started with, and that way I'm going to get those nice highlights mixed in that are going to give that hair so much dimension. So I am using that shade right now to just fill in any spaces that are left white, and now her hair is done. So I'm going to add some rosy cheeks to these two little fairy girls using R00, R20, and R22. I'll also color in the open mouth of the fairy on the left with the darkest two shades. So for the cheeks, I just add that R22 in kind of an oval shape to the side underneath the eye, and then I go around the edges of that with the R20, and then do the same with the R00, and I'm going to do that to the other panel while I have those colors out so I don't have to go back and forth between them. And just color that in the same way. And again, I will color in the open mouth of the fairy on the left with just the darkest two shades, a little R22 first and then the R20. And then I also wanted the fairy on the left of this first panel to have a pink party dress to match the darker pink bows in that pattern paper. So I'm going to take that R22 and start to do the shadows of her pleats. So her dress has all of these peaks and valleys, and I'm going to add my shadows in all of the valleys. So every place that the fabric dips down low, it would not be getting the light. So I'm going to add my shadows there, and any place that the fabric kind of raises upward, those are the peaks where the light would be reflecting the most, and so that is where I am going to add my highlights. I'm going to give her some little shoes to match, so I'm coloring those in the same way, blending out the R22 with the R20, and then using that R00 for the highlight. I'm also filling in the little loops that you see from the underside of her dress with that R00. And I did color in one of the butterflies down at the bottom with this pink combo. And I'm going to do that little air horn. I can never remember what those things are called. But anyway, that little party horn that the other fairy is holding, I'm going to do in pink as well. For the second panel, I'm going to do a pink candle. So I'm going to start with my shadows on the right, since that fairy is holding on, and she would be casting a shadow on it since her face and arm overlap. So once I have my shadows laid in, I'm going to come in with the R20 and do my midtone, and then fill in with the R00. But then I'm going to go back to that R22 and I'm going to fill in all of those little ridges that are drawn so that they look more concave. So it looks like, the surface isn't completely smooth on that candle. And then I'll do one of the little butterflies down at the bottom. I'm going to do the one on the left side, so it's kind of on the opposite of the large pink candle. And that way we have a little bit of balance on our scene. I'll also take that R22 and add that to some of the little confetti pieces. Back to the first panel, I wanted the candle to have some white stripes on it. So I'm going to use E40 and E41. And this time my shadow is also falling on the right because it's tipped down toward the ground that way. And our fairy is back behind it, so she would not be casting a shadow over top. For the other stripes, I wanted to go with kind of like a minty green to pull out some of the bows in that pattern paper. And I went with G00, YG41, and YG45. So I added in my shadows with the YG45, and then I'm blending toward the left with the YG41 and filling in with that G00, which blends really nicely with these other two shades. Then I'm going to switch back to the other panel and I'm going to do the dress of the fairy on the right in this combo. Again, I'm using that YG45 for my shadows and just paying attention to the pleats in the dress, how that is falling, and which parts would be in shadow and which parts would be highlighted. So the parts that are going over her knees are going to be highlighted, and then the parts that are kind of swinging back or behind that fabric in folds are going to be where the shadows are. And then I also just colored in the belt area with that YG45 completely, and then blended out with the YG41 and added that G00 for the highlight. And then I'll also take that YG45 and just add a few more of these little confetti pieces that are kind of scattered into the air around this one little fairy girl, and just fill those in, adding a little YG41 where it is needed. And then I'm going to move on to that kind of golden yellow that is in that pattern paper, and I'll use that for my candle flames. I went with Y00, Y21, and Y28, and I will do that for both of the candles so that they both match that pattern paper. And then I'm also going to add that to one of my little butterflies. I'm going to do it on this first panel. I'll do it for this small butterfly at the bottom left. And I just used the darkest two shades for that since it was super tiny. Next up, I'm going to bring in BG00, BG10 and BG11, and I will do the party dress of my other little fairy on the right on this panel. And again, I'm just paying attention to those folds of fabric where the valleys and the peaks are and placing those shadows in the valleys. It's a little bit tricky with the front piece, but I just added a little bit of darkness down at the bottom in the center. And then I went back over that once again to just make it a little bit more saturated without going to a darker marker. And then I'll switch to my midtone, which is going to be the BG10, and I'll just start to blend that out. And then I'll fill in with that BG00, and again I will also fill in the little loop of the underside of her dress that you can see with that lighter shade. Sometimes I like to color the underside darker, and sometimes I like to color it lighter. It just depends on my mood. Some fabrics are that way, so it just depends on you and what you want to do. But I'm also going to do the fairy on the left on the second panel with this same combo. So she has an aqua party dress. Again, just pulling that color from that pattern paper and coloring in her shoes to match. And I'll also do the last little butterfly down at the bottom right on this panel. I'll blend out that BG11 with the BG10 and then fill in with the BG quadruple 0. And I really like the soft pastel shades of the colors that I've chosen today. I really was inspired by that pattern paper, and I like how that turned out. I thought that was just really pretty and soft for spring. Even though this is a regular birthday card, it doesn't necessarily have to be given in the spring. It is springtime, so I might as well lean into that and be inspired by that pattern paper. I'm going to use BG70 to give just the barest hint of color to the fairy's wings, concentrating that more toward the bottom of each of those wings, and then kind of fading into the white cardstock at the top. And I'll do that for the second panel as well. Just adding that underneath the first fairy's arms. And then for this fairy, it's a little bit tricky because I haven't done her hair yet. So I just added it toward the top where that would still show. And then I wanted to give these fairies a little bit of ground to stand on. I decided to leave the background top part behind them white. I will add a little bit of detail to that later on, but I'm going to leave the background white. Which is something that I almost never do. In fact, it was really uncomfortable for me to leave that background white, but I wanted those fairies to really shine in their soft colors, and I was afraid that any background color that I would add would kind of detract from that. So I'm just going to add in a little bit of shadow below them using E40, E42, and E43, just so they're not completely floating in the air there. I added in the shadows under their feet with the E43, and then I'm blending out with the E42, and then the E41. And I will also take my colorless blender and just go over the edge of that E41 and help that kind of fade into the background. That first panel is done now. I'm going to switch to the second panel so that I can finish this one off, and I'll begin with the ground for them as well. Since I already have these markers out, I might as well continue coloring with them rather than having to come back to them later. I will have to come back to one of the combos later because I forgot to add the yellow into the confetti around this fairy whose little shadows I'm doing right now. So I will have to come back to those golden tones just for that later on. But I like to not have to keep opening my markers. You know, every time you're opening your markers, a little bit of that alcohol is evaporating and they're starting to dry out. And then, of course, they're also getting dried out because you're using the ink inside. So I rather just continue coloring them while I have them open than switch back and forth repeatedly. So if I have the markers out and, you know, it's not like a huge area that I have to worry about the markers drying out anyway, then I will just continue to color with those usually. So I'm just doing the same thing for these two fairies, adding in that shadow underneath them, trying to draw a straight line back behind them to kind of give the illusion of, you know, the floor. And then making that kind of softer and kind of fade out as we get toward the front of it. And then using that colorless blender to soften that front edge even more. So I'm moving on to my third hair combo, which is going to be red because I absolutely love red hair. I have always been drawn to it. I do have a lot of redheads in my family. My mom's a redhead. My grandpa was a redhead. I have an uncle, a cousin, my niece, nephew. There's lots of redheads in my family, and also all growing up, my favorite actresses have always been redheaded women. I just really am drawn to them. My favorite book of all time, Anne of Green Gables, is about a redhead, and to this day, if I see a book cover that has a redheaded woman on it, I will always pick it up and see what it's about. I just am really drawn to it for whatever reason. And so the colors I'm using are YR12, YR14, YR18, and E18. And I do curly hair completely different than straight hair. First of all, I just do a base layer of the lightest shade, which is YR12 in this case. And then I start to add in my other colors, putting little curly cues close to the face and then little dots as I move further out. And also I concentrate the darkest color closest around the face and then move out to lighter curly cues and dots as I move out toward the edges of the hair. So I'm working my way up to that E18 right now, just adding in that last little bit of darkness, and then I'm going to work my way back down in the reverse. And I am overlapping some of those dots and curly cues so that they all kind of start to blend together. And it does kind of look odd at first as you're adding these in, but once you start to build that up, it really starts to come together and look like curly hair. So I'm going to continue working my way down there, and then I will go back in with my E18 and just add a touch more of that darkest shade really close to the face like I mentioned, and my marker looked like it was about to leak, so I just pulled off the other cap so that I could continue on and not worry about having any ink splooges and ruining my images. But I just finished that up, and then I'm going to let that dry. I did go back and add a little bit extra of that YR18 as well, just darkening up the area around the face. And then I'm going to move on to our last little girl, and she is interesting in two different ways. First of all, the area in the front of her hair is like straight, so you would color it like straight hair, but the back of her hair is curly, so there's that to contend with. But then also she has one of her fairy wings overlapping her hair, so that also makes it interesting because I like to do anything that goes behind the fairy wing to be a little bit lighter so that that wing looks kind of transparent. And so I am using E21, E23, E25 and E27 for her, and for those areas on top of her head framing her face that are straight, I'm going to color them just like I did with the straight hair on the first card, but then I'm going to do the curly parts just like I did on this fairy on the left with the red hair. And as I'm working with the lighter two shades, I'm going to do the entire head, but then once I start to add in the darkest two shades, I'll only add those to the areas that are not behind the fairy's wings. So the area behind the fairy's wings is only getting the E21 and the E23, but all of the rest of the hair is also going to get the E25 and the E27. And I hope you can see how that looks. It's just a little bit lighter, but I think it's really effective. So I did go back to that Y21 and Y26 to finish off my little confetti pieces, and that completes the coloring. So I'll pull in the other panels so you can see them side by side, and then we'll move on to our pattern paper. So I'm going back to my Cartabella, that's my girl 6x6 pad, and I'm going to choose another print to contrast with that because the die that I'm going to be using for this frame cuts out two different parts, and so I want to have two different contrasting colors to just add a little bit of extra interest. So I went with this kind of pink sprinkly pattern. It has like a really loose sprinkle to it that's very organic looking, and it kind of reminded me of sprinkles on a cake, so I thought that went well with the birthday theme. So I trimmed these pattern papers down, and I knew that using the bow print was kind of a risk because on the thinner piece on the inside of this die, which by the way is the Hello Bluebird Gallery Frame number 2, the inner piece is a little bit thinner, and so you don't get to see very much of those bows, and it ends up looking kind of strange. Like most of the areas, it has like these random squiggles, and then you only see the bows in a few little places. And I really didn't like the way that that looked. It just wasn't working for me at all. And so because I had kind of been torn between the two different prints at the beginning, I had that bow print, but then also a floral print. I decided to go back and look for that and maybe use that for the second card. So I'm just going through my pattern paper and trying to find that print. And I always like to take from the back of the pad first. I don't know why. I just like to keep the front of the pad more together. Because sometimes the pattern paper pads start to fall apart when you tear the papers out of them. And so I just like to do that from the back so that the front is still all together with the cover. But I tore that out, and I'm going to run that through my die cutting machine once again with that Hello Bluebird Gallery frame number 2 again. And the outer part of that frame I can save for another card, but I'm going to use just the inner part with the pink frame from the leftovers that I used with the bow. And I didn't have that die cut completely correctly. I did have to kind of just tear off one little part because my cutting plate is kind of really bowed. I need to replace it. I've just been putting it off. And then I'm going to flip these pieces over to the back side, and I'm going to just tape them together with a little bit of Scotch Magic tape. And I like to just tear it into a thinner strip so that it fits behind those papers. And then I just line that up and tape these two pieces back together so that they work together as one unit. And then I can use the other piece that I tore off for the opposite end. And then I just need one more longer piece for the two sides, and I'll tear that in half so that works the same. Just trying to tear that right down the center so that I keep it kind of even so that it will fit behind that pattern paper frame. So then I'll just line that up on one of the edges so that it is all held together nicely. And it was a little bit too long, so I'm just going to trim that off with my Cutter Bee Teflon coated scissors. And then I'll add the other piece of tape over on the opposite side. And then I'm going to repeat this exact same process for the second frame off screen. And then I will also trim down some thin strips of Scotch 3M foam tape so I can pop that up later on. Now I've created 2 card panels with the MFT snow cone cardstock, and I'm stamping on the inside of my card in Lawn Fawn Merman ink, and I'm stamping down another one of the Fairwee images from that birthday stamp set and using the happy birthday sentiment. And these had some residue from the manufacturer still on them because I've never used them yet. So I just cleaned that off with my stamp scrubby, and then I'm stamping that down a couple more times again so that that ink is at a more consistent level. So I think I ended up doing it like 3 times until I was happy with the consistency, and there was even like a little place that I wanted to add just a touch more. And then for the second card, I'm actually going to make the exact same card base. Since the fronts are different and the inside goes with either one, I just decided to keep it simple and stamp the same exact thing on both. So again, I stamped that down 3 times until I was happy with it. And then I'm going to just add that ink to the same spot, which didn't seem to be sticking down, and then I can start to assemble these cards. So I've trimmed down those panels just slightly so they will fit behind those frames and not have any white cardstock showing through. And then I just had to decide which frame I wanted to use with which card. And I decided to add the bow print to this first one with the 2 little fairies with the pink and blue dresses. And I'm very carefully lining that up, making sure that the sentiment part is also centered in that lower frame. And I went with the floral print for the second panel because there's a little bit of a peach tone in that pattern paper that isn't in the bow print, that kind of matched with the red-headed fairy. So I thought that those went better together. So again, I'm just going to line that up really carefully so that that sentiment is straight in there and the fairies are straight in the top panel. And once I'm happy with how that's looking, I'll just press that down into place. Then I'll grab my card bases and I will glue these to my cards with my Barely Art Precision Craft Glue. I'll just add a little bit of liquid glue around the edges and through the center where that little center part of the frame is. And then I'll just line those up on my card front, making sure I have the same amount of that pale blue cardstock showing through on all 4 sides. And then I'll do the second one exactly the same. And then I got inspired by that confetti on that left panel to help fill in some of that background, since I'm just not used to leaving a plain white background and it just felt a little unlike me. So I decided to go back to the darkest shade of each of the 4 color combos that I used for the main areas of the fairies. And so I used the pink color, the yellow color, the aqua color, and the green color, the darkest shade of each of those, which was the R22, the Y26, the YG45, and the BG11. And I'm just adding in some dots all around that background on both of those panels so that it looks like there's a little bit of confetti kind of floating around the scene. And I really was happier with how that turned out. It just helped fill in some of that empty space. I'm really not good with white space on the cards. I know that a lot of people like the clean and simple look, but I am not a minimalist, and so that just helped me feel a little bit better. But then the bottom part near the sentiment also felt a little empty, so I decided to add a little bit of that confetti around the sentiment as well, but just on a softer scale, so I didn't go quite as heavy-handed with it, just a few dots of each of those shades to kind of just add a little bit of something and bring those colors down toward the bottom of the scene. And I really like how that helped tie these 2 cards together as well. So they each have their own unique look with the different pattern paper, but they also look like they could be part of a set or something because of the shape of the frame and the matching sentiments and butterflies, and, you know, using the same stamp set and all of that. So the last step I'm going to do is to add a bit of glitter to these cards. I'm going to take some Stardust Stickles and add that to my fairy's wings and also to the flame on each of the candles and the butterfly's wings. So I'm just going to do that for both of the cards. And if I get a little bit that goes over the black line, I just wipe it away with my finger before that dries so that it doesn't obscure the line and, you know, then make the image look a little bit blurry. So once I have that filled in, I thought it might be nice to have a little bit of extra glitter. So I'm just going to add some glitter confetti to the mix as well, just kind of tapping that nib all around where the confetti areas are so that we have an extra little bit of sparkle when the recipient tips the cards into the light. So I'm going to lift each one of these up so you can see them in a bit more detail, and I'll give you another peek at the inside as well. I really hope you guys enjoyed these ones. I had so much fun coloring these sweet little fairies. If you enjoyed it too, please be sure to give it a like and leave me a comment down below and let me know which one is your favorite. I don't know if I could pick. I like aspects of each one of them, and so I can't really decide. So anyway, if you guys are interested in any of the products that I used, I will have them listed and linked in the description bar below the video. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. You can click on either one to check them out. If you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, I invite you to do so and ring that notification bell so you're always alerted when I post new videos. And thank you guys so much for spending your time with me today. I will see you soon in the next one. Bye-bye.